Hello everyone, welcome to What If Issei Was the Son of Monkey D. Luffy and Boa Hancock Part 3. Before we start, please go support Au.Moonbw for writing that awesome fanfic. Now let's begin. Chapter 15. A simple conversation. When Ichigo looked into his childhood friend's eyes, he felt a chill. For a brief moment, he saw in Issei the figure of a dragon, a beast, looking at him, without the orange head being able to understand what was going through said dragon's head. When Issei looked Ichigo in the eyes, it wasn't what he saw that made him curious, but what he felt. In his childhood friend with orange hair, he felt different types of energy intertwined, like a knot in a rope that was so tangled that it might be impossible to untangle the knot. Despite that, there was a type of energy that at the moment seemed more distinct than the others, which only made the Hyoudou more confused. L-chan? Drake. Not recognizing whatever was inside Ichigo, Issei tried to turn to the two with more experience. Sorry, Ice-kun, but I've never seen anything like this either. Although somewhat familiar, I can't point out what form of energy is inside him. But he was out of luck. Issei. After a few moments of silence of the two just staring at each other, Ichigo finally reacted. Chichichi, took you long enough. The brunette said, laughing at finally being recognized. Instantly Ichigo's mood lifted. He held out his hand, to which Issei responded by raising his hand, with the two raising their arms, their elbows almost touching, their forearms touching, and their hands clasped around each other. That allowed Issei to notice his friend's strength, which seemed above standard for a normal human of their age. And Ichigo, despite his low experience as a Shinigami, could see that Issei's strength appeared to be out of the ordinary as well, even more than his. Both were barely initiated into the supernatural world, a world that they now knew in one way or another and without communicating properly, that the other was part of too. Still, they didn't bring it up, at least for the time being. Both simply walked in, with Issei explaining how he and Cynthia were now going to Kuo Academy as well. It's good to have you back. Contrary to the more energetic reaction of the others, Ichigo gave a small smile as he said that to the couple. It was simple, but as honest as the others. And then he stopped, seeming to think about something. Wait, are you two our senpais? The orange head's voice made him sound a little shocked, which he probably was. Itsuki and Izuko, who like Ichigo were also in their first year, stopped what they were doing, only now realizing, thanks to Ichigo, that in fact that the couple would be their senpais. Chichichi, you can call me senpai-sama Issei. The Hyoudou speaks, in a comical and pompous manner, making the others laugh. With Ichigo having joined the group, he had the opportunity to taste Issei's food, giving the same compliments that the others had already given, which only showed that the Leviathan lived up to Sanji's teachings. However, Nezuko's previous conversation still seemed to weigh heavily on the table, especially on Nezuko's own part. To resolve this, each of the Kamado brothers would talk with Cynthia and Issei, respectively. Nezuko did everything to not look at Cynthia. She nervously twirled the tips of her hair, staring at all the different parts of her room, except for where the blonde was standing. Yufufu, you don't need to be so nervous, I don't bite. And the fact that Cynthia's tone still was so friendly didn't make her any more comfortable. You and Ice are still dating, right? Nezuko asks with a mixture of fear and shyness. But of course. Cynthia responded with a smile and a nod of her head. There was no hesitation and she was clearly more comfortable than Nezuko. The blonde's confirmation made Nezuko bite her lower lip and turn her face away, ashamed to face her friend. The words she'd spoken earlier at the table kept coming back into her head, leaving her with both shame and guilt. I see. I'm sorry about that. It was noticeable by her tone that, if she could, Nezuko would already have gone out of the room. Yufufu, I think you misunderstood me, Nezu-chan. Nezuko wasn't sure what kind of reaction she expected from Cynthia, but she knew it wasn't this. The dark-haired girl finally had the courage, with curiosity playing a role, to look at her childhood friend and see her with the same smile as always. In fact, if Nezuko had to guess, she'd say that Cynthia's smile looked more mischievous than usual. What do you mean? Nezuko's curiosity and confusion now clouded her earlier embarrassment, allowing her to ask that simple question. Cynthia leaned down, putting herself face to face with the dark-haired girl. Do you remember Ice's dream? Cynthia's smile widened as Nezuko tilted her head to the side with a thoughtful expression. After a few seconds of silence between the two, the dark-haired one widens her eyes, her cheeks blushing as she remembers something. I want a harem. Issei, who was 5 years old at the time, spoke without the slightest bit of shame. On the contrary, there was a certain pride in his voice. The few adults around were looking at the children with confused looks. What a stupid thing. Itsuki said before they went back to playing normally. Back then she didn't even know what the word meant and had forgotten about it after a while. She only remembered it now because Issei had repeated that phrase a few times. Of course, now she knew what harem meant, but it took Cynthia to remind her of the determination that Issei had since childhood. You mean that? Nezuko didn't finish, both because the idea seemed a bit surreal to her and because she was redder than a tomato and couldn't face Cynthia. Doesn't that bother you? Though she couldn't help but ask, glancing at her friend out of the corner of her eyes. It was Cynthia's turn to look confused, which undeniably surprised Nezuko. Oh, right. Sometimes I forget that this kind of thing is not normal for you. And if Nezuko thought she was confused before, the blonde's speech just made it worse. What? Well, Issei's father has a harem and our families live together, so this is normal for us. Nezuko was no longer just confused, she had completely frozen. From her perspective, polygamous relationships only existed under two conditions, either in the past with wealthy nobles or the like, or currently with womanizers who cared nothing but their own pleasure. The first option did not apply. But was Issei the type of person who only cared about himself? Who made you cry? I will kill them. A slight smile formed on her face. She knew the answer. Yufufu, you finally smiled. Cynthia's comment takes Nezuko out of her thoughts and makes her face her friend again. This time instead of a mischievous smile or anything like that, the blonde was just happy that her dark-haired friend wasn't trying to hide her face instead of looking at her. Were you serious? Only now Nezuko understood that, for the most part, Cynthia was just trying to make her see that she didn't need to feel ashamed or guilty about the comment on the table. That said, she found Cynthia's way of comforting her very odd. Obviously. And again, Nezuko didn't know how to respond to the blonde, who said it without a hint of hesitation. I don't understand you anymore. Nezuko said, puffing out her cheek and pouting. At least it was noticeable that she was much more comfortable than before. Cynthia laughed at her friend's expression and sat on her side on the bed. I've been serious this whole time. What you said is nothing to overthink and everyone knows it was in the spur of the moment. However, if it reflects what you want, Issei will always be open to you. Of course, I don't have any complaints either. And obviously, none of this is something you need to think about right now, just let things take their own course. She finishes saying, giving Nezuko a wink, who in turn puts her legs on the bed and hugs her knees. In her childhood, she did have a crush on Issei, but it was a childish thing. However, she wouldn't deny that she was a lot happier than usual to see him and of course Cynthia, again, and especially to find out that they would now be seeing each other almost every day. What did that mean for her? Nezuko still didn't know. Okay, thanks In-chan. But she would take Cynthia's advice and just go with it. Even so, I'm still a little embarrassed to face Issei. She admitted with a weak smile. If it helps you, I know that Issei didn't feel any shame on his part. Somehow, that made Nezuko feel less embarrassed and happier, knowing that Issei was serious. And in another part of the house, a similar but much shorter conversation took place. You were serious, right? Tanjiro asked, smiling much less than usual. Absolutely. Issei replied with the same seriousness. You wouldn't play with her feelings, would you? Having sisters, Issei understood where Tanjiro was coming from, but even so, those kinds of questions that assumed he would do things he loathed bothered him a bit. Never. Tanjiro looked deep into his childhood friend's eyes, just to see how serious and determined Issei was. In fact, to the red-tipped-haired boy, it even looked like Issei had the determination to die before he hurt Nezuko. It was probably his imagination though. Would you do anything to make her happy? Now it was the kind of thing Issei understood being asked. For sure. Now Tanjiro could see a glint in Issei's eyes, a determination he could understand as ensuring Nezuko's happiness at any cost. And that was something he understood well. Sorry about that Issei. You know how I am with Nezuko. In the end, even Tanjiro knew that some of those questions might have been a little too much, but he couldn't help it. And that was something Issei knew. Relax, you're just doing what you can to protect her, I get it. Hyoudou said, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. Anyway, whatever Nezuko decides, our mother and I will always support her, and I know you will too. Tanjiro spoke, clearly more relaxed. Kichichi, for sure. After that conversation, the mood had gotten much better for both of them. They left Tanjiro's room and went to the living room. Halfway down the hall Issei stopped and looked out the window at a building across the street. His expression was neutral, he turned his head and continued into the living room. He saw Nezuko and Cynthia returning as well, and he waved at the two. Both responded by waving back with a smile. Everything seemed in place. What were you doing with the newbie? Until they reached the living room. Itsuki, with an unfriendly face, demanded something from Ichigo, who looked away. Orihime constantly turned her head from one to the other, not knowing what to say, since she wanted to take both sides. I don't know what you're talking about. The orange-haired said, looking away. Itsuki just narrowed her eyes as she took her cell phone out. Kuniita sent me this. She showed a picture of Ichigo and Rukia walking their separate ways, after clearly saying goodbye to each other. That was right after they took care of the hollow. What probably happened is that someone in their class or some of the others saw them and took the picture to spread gossip. Mentally, Ichigo wanted to beat himself up for not noticing someone sooner. In front of others, he didn't know how to explain himself. "Kurosaki-kun, are you and Kichiki-san dating?" Itsuki, Issei, Cynthia, Tanjiro, and Nezuko collectively felt a pain in their chest, hearing Oriham's hurt voice. What made it worse was that Ichigo was clearly oblivious to that detail. Of course not. At least his answer was sincere. In reality, even without having Issei and Cynthia's observation haki, everyone could hear a certain rejection of that thought in Ichigo's voice. Is she blackmailing you? Issei says the first thing that comes to mind. Cynthia was intrigued, Nezuko and Tanjiro considered the idea seriously, Orihime looked shocked by the revelation, and Totsuki and Ichigo looked at Issei, wondering if he was serious or not. Ara, you all have quite an imagination. But why don't you wait until Monday to ask your colleague about it? I said with a smile on her face, enjoying watching their interactions. However, noting that Ichigo clearly wanted to keep some secret and that this conversation wasn't going anywhere, she pointed at an alternate exit. Orihime's eyes sparkled and Totsuki looked at Ichigo with a smug smile. Thanks for the idea, Aunt. Itsuki spoke humming, and Orihime also looked excited, though it was hard to tell if it was the prospect of getting close to the newbie or knowing about a relationship with Ichigo. As for Ichigo, he rolled his eyes. At least he didn't have to worry about that anymore since Rukia wouldn't open her mouth. After that, the group was preparing to leave since it was getting late. Would you like a ride in the car? I asks the group, worried about the time. Don't worry Kai-san, we'll go home with them. Issei replies, clarifying. He, Cynthia and Ichigo would take Totsuki and Orihime to their houses and then. Well, Issei and Ichigo had some catching up to do and of course, Cynthia would follow along. I understand. Come back whenever you want and please take care. I spoke with a gentle smile, to which Issei responded by also smiling, a smile that for some reason made the older woman feel her cheeks flush slightly. She judged it to be just her impression. Can we meet tomorrow? Besides her mother, Nezuko asked Is with a blushed face. Of course, whenever you want. The Sekiryu spoke, ruffling the top of Nezuko's head, who smiled and stuck her tongue out at him. Yufufu, we'll stop by when we can. Cynthia says, to which both Tanjiro and Kai nod. Aye, Aunt. Thank you for receiving us. Alright, see you later. Itsuki, Orihime, and Ichigo speak respectively. See you later. Tanjiro and Nezuko respond, and so the group heads out of the house. It was already night, around 7 o'clock, but the lighting on the street was good and several pedestrians were walking in different directions. The group talked about various things on the way, catching up on some matters. Until Issei stopped, seeming to have noticed something. Damn, I forgot a thing. I will be back in a moment. Before anyone could say anything the brunette had turned around and run away. Everyone looked at Cynthia curiously, but she just shrugged, not knowing how to explain, or pretending not to know, what he could have forgotten. Any news from 06? At the top of the building across from the Kamado household, a group of 3 men, all hooded and with swords and pistols, were talking into a walkie-talkie. We found him, but 07 and 08 seem to have been killed. I don't understand, 06 has lost an eye and is in a delirious state, talking about snakes and dinosaurs. That left the group confused, but their first thought was possibly the effect of a sacred gear, whatever it was. Oh, looks like you found Apple. The voice suddenly spoke from the middle of the group. The 3 jumped back in fright, but reacted quickly, pointing their weapons at the stranger, who was obviously Issei. Yo. Chapter 16. About gods of death and honest. Identify yourself. Demanded one of the hooded ones, the one Issei guessed was the group's leader, with his pistol pointed at the Sekiryu. Nah, thanks. But who are you guys? The Leviathan says unconcerned, as he answers the question with a question of his own. However, what stunned the 3 was that the brunette was no longer among them. Issei's voice came from the side, and when the leader turned his face he saw Issei's face staring at him. Shy. One of the lackeys tried to fight back, drawing his katana to attack the Sekiryu. Issei just blinked and stretched out his left hand, moving his index and middle fingers to grip and break the tip of the sword. Then he turns his hand and throws the tip of the blade at the man's neck. The tip of the katana goes through his neck out to the other side, causing a spurt of blood to come out of the 2 holes. However, before a single drop landed on the ground, Issei pointed at the dead body, causing blue fire to erupt from his fingertip, covering the whole body. It was a single blast of flame, and yet everything, the body, the blood, the weapons, turned to ash and vanished in the night wind. The blue flame raised the temperature at the top of the building, but for the remaining 2, the heat was non-existent, their bodies cold from the terror the stranger had instilled in them with few moves. Their first instincts were to run, but before they could even turn around a colossal pressure descended, both on their bodies, minds, and souls. The one who wasn't the leader fainted while the leader himself just didn't pass out because Issei stopped using his conqueror's haki before that. Even so, the leader felt his limbs weak and soft like gelatin, he no longer had the strength or will to resist. Let's go. Issei catches the man by his collar as the boosted gear manifests in his left hand. The leader has a brief moment of shock, finally realizing that he was standing in front of this generation's Red Dragon Emperor. That said, he couldn't understand what the Sekiryuute was doing here as they had no connection with the Hakuryuku. Adjustment. 200, boost. The words that were announced by the gear made the leader even more confused, but he didn't have time to consider it. One of the abilities of Aura was to read the minds or actions of other beings, so using a boost with a value of 200, Issei gained the ability to directly enter his target's mind, seeing all the information he needed. That said, because of its intrusive nature, the Leviathan didn't use this ability very often. Let's see. But the thought he entered the hooded one's mind, envisioning his secrets and goals. A few moments passed and blood began to flow from the leader's eyes. It was one of the side effects and one of the reasons Issei avoided using this skill too often, as those with weaker minds could simply break. However, after seeing everything he needed to, there was no remorse in the Sekiryute's eyes, just silent rage. Without thinking twice, he also burned the leader's body to nothing. DSK, shit. Looking around, Issei took a deep breath to calm himself down and think a bit about what he should do. Ice-kun, I think it's best now to find your friend and Shin-chan to understand what is going on with him. I highly doubt that this group of exorcists will act again tonight after things ended like this. You could call Apple and have her keep an eye out here, what do you think? Seeing that Issei was undecided, Alsha advised him, and the Sekiryuute didn't have to consider much to make his decision. Thank you L-chan. He thanks her, making the blonde smile in his headspace. Placing his thumb and index finger of his right hand in his mouth, Issei whistles. For a normal person, there didn't seem to be any sound coming out, but that didn't bother the Sekiryuute. He just sat and waited. Not long after, his wait was rewarded when a red snake appeared, having climbed through the building's vent. Did you call, boss? The snake asks, which Issei understands thanks to the voice of all things. If the remaining hooded man had been awake, he would have only heard the snake hissing, as Issei spoke to it as if she was a person. I want you to keep an eye on that house to see if one of these shows up. If it appears, whistle for me and stop them. He explains, placing his foot on top of the remaining one so that Apple can recognize their outfit. Okay, but what I do with this guy? She asks with obvious intentions. Do as you wish. The Sekiryuute answers, already at the border of the building. He didn't need to look to know that Apple had licked her lips and headed towards the human, having just secured her dinner for the night. Trusting that the snake would be enough to guard against any threat to the Komodo, Issei disappeared from the top of the building, returning to his friends. After leaving Orihime at home, and in the process Tatsuki pushed her friend, making Ichigo hold her, much to the strangeness of the orange-haired. Then they left Tatsuki at her home, who in turn said goodbye, smiling and lightly hitting her fist on Issei's chest. And now, Issei, Cynthia and Ichigo found themselves in the same park where they used to play as children. Ichigo was scratching his cheek, trying to think of how to start the subject. He knew that Issei, and probably Cynthia, were part of the supernatural world, but being a novice to the subject, he had no idea how to approach the conversation. I'm a dragon. It was the first thing Issei said as soon as they sat down. Cynthia wasn't surprised and laughed at how direct Issei was, while Ichigo was clearly stunned. He blinked several times at his childhood friend, absorbing the information. Wait. Say that again, please. In the end, Ichigo asks, wanting to be sure of what he heard. In response, Issei looks around. To the orange-haired, it looked like he was checking if there was anyone around, which there wasn't, but Issei was also checking presences and trying to see if anyone was watching them or heading that way. Upon making sure everything was good, Issei held up his left arm for Ichigo to see. His arm was taken over by blue scales, his hand took on a reptilian appearance, and his fingernails were replaced by long black claws. Ichigo stared at the transformation in amazement, not sure how he was supposed to react. That said, the shock he felt was not as big as he thought it should be. The biggest factor was just the surprise of seeing his friend's transformation, rather than the fact that he could actually transform. Facing hideous monsters and having received powers from a supposed goddess of death must have helped Ichigo with that. Can you do this with your whole body? It was the first question that came to Ichigo's head. Of course. Issei explains with a smile, making his arm revert to human form. But if he goes into full form, well, let's just say the city would probably go up in the air. Or the sea. Cynthia said jokingly and confusing Ichigo at the same time. It was just more stuff to ask about later. However, now that the blonde had said something, the substitute Shinigami couldn't help but look at her curiously. And you happen to be a dragon too? Yufufu, no, but we can say that I'm not human either. That said, I'm a little more complicated to explain than ice. One of the most intriguing discoveries that Vegapunk made was about the difference between what are considered to be humans from the original world the Straw Hats come from and normal humans from other worlds. When comparing the lineage factor of both, the scientist noticed something curious: the humans from Straw Hat's original world had a significant amount of genetic difference compared to humans of other worlds, which would explain the lack of people like Whitebeard or Big Mom in those other worlds. And Cynthia's case, being the daughter of Sanji, a genetically modified being, and Pudding, a Triclops, she really couldn't be considered human. At the moment though, that was too much information for Ichigo, so it was best to share one thing at a time. I understand. Ichigo replied, scratching his head. Truth be told, he was a lot less shocked than he thought he should be. My turn, huh? He asks, with a weak smile, and then pulls something out of his pocket, a small candy dispenser. But with their observation hockey, Issei and Cynthia knew that it wasn't just a candy, as they felt the presence of a soul there. The couple watches, and as soon as the candy enters Ichigo's mouth, they see the orange one being thrown back, but now with a black kimono and a large heavy sword at his waist. And besides that, there was now a second Ichigo, who was in the original one's body, and looked between the real one and Issei and Cynthia, not knowing what to say. So cool. Issei yelled as he practically jumped out of his chair, his eyes shining like stars. He jumped to Ichigo's side and looked his friend up and down. You can transform like me and Cynthia. The Sekiryuite says, laughing and clapping his friend on the back. I think so. Issei's reaction put a smile on Ichigo's face. After days of having to hide his new powers and what he was doing, it was quite satisfying to share this with friends who could understand what he was going through. Mr. Ichigo, are you sure that Ms. Rukia would approve of you sharing that you are a Shinigami? That thing in Ichigo's body spoke with remarkable anxiety. Possession technique? Cynthia asks curiously, noting that what came out was Ichigo's soul. This magic seemed a bit useful, especially for keeping it a secret while he needed to get out for whatever it was he got himself into. Something like it, I guess. Ichigo replies, ignoring his double and not being sure of his own words. Anyway, Kon, be quiet and I'll talk to Rukia later. He declares, returning to his body, as he has already shown them enough. Issei and Cynthia notice that as soon as the original soul returns, the candy that Ichigo had eaten jumps out of his mouth for him to catch and put back in the dispenser. Rukia? Is this by any chance the new student Tatsuki was talking about? Cynthia asks after hearing the name repeated a few times. In response, Ichigo sighs and nods. It's a long story. Do you have time to tell? Issei asks, returning to the seat next to Cynthia. Ichigo sees the time, noting that it was still 7:40 p.m. He luckily didn't have any messages from Rukia, but he did from his sisters. Quickly replying that he would be out for a little longer, he turns his attention to his childhood friends. A bit. And now I work for her for free. Doing her job and she still eats my food. Finishing recounting the events leading up to gaining his powers, Ichigo slams the table, irritated by the payments for his job, or lack thereof. Shinigami, huh? He didn't think it was so easy to create gods. Cynthia murmurs thoughtfully. I don't feel like a god or anything. Ichigo replies ironically, opening his arms and looking at them. If I'm feeling like anything, it's an unpaid worker or an intern, pretty much the same thing. Despite laughing at his joke, unfortunately, Issei and Cynthia don't seem to notice it. God of death. Well, that's a bit ironic. Although our friendship with Uncle Susanoo is ironic too. Issei talks to himself, crossing his arms, reflecting on the fact that his family, the D, were originally enemies of the gods, while maintaining positive relations with all the gods he has encountered in this world so far. Susanoo. Hearing the name of the god of storms, Ichigo thought he was mistaken, but the fact that Issei just casually nodded and Cynthia looked at him, not seeming to understand his confusion, said everything he needed to know. I have so many questions. He finishes by saying, massaging his forehead. Chichichi, do you have time? Seeing his cell phone again, and noting that nearly 20 minutes had passed, Ichigo shook his head. If I take a little longer, it is possible for my father and my sisters to start a search through the whole city. And he didn't seem to be kidding. We can talk more tomorrow then. Cynthia proposes, to which Ichigo nods in agreement. Give me your guys' numbers. He says, taking out his cell phone. I don't have one of those. We still need to arrange it. And this is the response of the brunette and the blonde, respectively. Ichigo blinks a few times, not expecting that. In the end, he just sighs and puts his phone away. Let's meet tomorrow morning at Tanjiro and Nezuko's house. We'll have time to talk later. The mention of the Kamado causes Issei's attitude to change. It was subtle, but his expression became more serious and even his posture underwent slight changes. While this went unnoticed by Ichigo, Cynthia noticed something wrong with her boyfriend. What's the problem? It's about Nezuko and Tanjiro. Cynthia tilts her head curiously and Ichigo furrows his eyebrows in confusion. When I went back I didn't go to their house. When we were there I noticed 3 guys were watching them from the building across the way. The blonde didn't seem surprised by that, having already taken note of those presences herself. She knew this was what Issei was dealing with when he momentarily broke away from the group. What? Ichigo, however, was taken by surprise. They were exorcists. Issei elaborated further. It was Cynthia's turn to frown and it was Ichigo's turn to be even more confused. Rukia hadn't formally introduced him to the supernatural world, but knowing the existence of devils, the existence of exorcists who were active in the supernatural was only logical. What would exorcists want with them? Cynthia questions with confusion. From what I saw with one of the exorcists, apparently both are descendants of Anis. A glint of clarity passed in the blonde's eyes. Since childhood, the two always felt something different about the pair brother and sister, and even after asking Drake, he only explained that there was a possibility that they were descended from Yaukes, but they never got to know what kind. At least until now. What did you do with them? Ichigo asks, glaring at Issei. Got rid of. He doesn't elaborate further, but Ichigo already had his answer. He wasn't sure how he should react to knowing that his friend had killed, but his actions as a Shinigami had sensitized him to violence recently. And to top that, the fact that they were stalking the Komodo showed. They had no good intentions. He didn't feel too conflicted about the death of someone who wanted to hurt his friends. From the way you're talking, does it seem like there's more of them? After collecting his thoughts, Ichigo asked seriously. After all, if Issei had already dealt with the problem, he wouldn't be bringing it up. From what I managed to get from one of them, there must be at least 7 more, no, 5 more out there. I have Apple, my snake, watching, so they must be safe for now. Deciding to ignore, at least for the moment, that Issei supposedly had a snake as a pet that he left behind to protect the Komodos, Ichigo nodded, trusting his friend. Okay, let's keep an eye out tomorrow in case something happens. Ichigo speaks, while he sighs and gets up from the chair. I need to go now, if anything happens let's hope it doesn't. He ends by saying, remembering that they don't have cell phones. See you tomorrow. Cynthia speaks in farewell. If you need help with the hollows. Just call. That makes Issei decide that they should probably have cell phones soon. Sure, thanks. Ichigo finishes by saying, already walking out of the park. Well, let's go meet Apple, and if everything is fine, time to go home. Yufufu, sounds great. Outside of Kuo, away from the senses of the devils, Rukia and even Issei, in the middle of one of the forests that surrounded the city, a shadow of a tree stirred. The shadow rose as if it was a liquid substance that something was trying to get rid of, and at last, 2 people came out of said shadow. Both looked the same as the other exorcists, except that one carried a gas mask attached to an oxygen tank. What it is? The one with the oxygen mask asks, after taking it off. His partner was watching something on his phone, which he assumed were notifications. 2 entire groups were wiped out, of which only 06 survived and seems traumatized. That alerts the other one. Were we discovered by the devils? It's a possibility to consider. He answers, nodding his head. But, in the shadows of night reflection, they cannot sense the presence of our sacred gears, so the others should be safe. It's a bit worrying, but the operation remains the same. I'll just give orders that there are no more for today. But tomorrow. We will finish what was not done years ago. Chapter 17. Calm. The couple quickly arrived at the building where Apple was still watching over the Komodo, ensuring that everything was safe. There were no other suspicious movements in the surrounding area, and the family was fine. Issei and Cynthia observed their surroundings one last time, using observation haki and aura, and could confirm that there was no risk. Apple volunteered to keep watch, hoping to grab another snack in case anyone came by, and the Sekirute saw no reason to refuse. So the two were finally able to return to their new home. We have to ask Uncle to get one of those cell phones for us. Cynthia commented as soon as the two got close to the house. Those things seem useful, but I still think a Den Den Mushi is cooler. Issei said smiling. Yufufu indeed. There are a lot of things that I would still like to bring here, but first, we have to get the proper space. The Sekirute nodded, agreeing with the blonde. Yeah, Chichisi, but one thing at a time. We barely arrived, so let's enjoy. He finished saying, making Cynthia smile. It was typical of Issei to be more concerned with enjoying the moment than making excessive plans about the future. Indeed, and for now Cynthia starts to say, leaning into Issei and having to stand on her tiptoes to barely manage to whisper in his ear. She didn't have to finish for Issei to know what his girlfriend was thinking. A big ear-to-ear smile spread across the secretary's face as the two moved to the bathroom. I've never been so grateful that Jehovah allowed disconnecting the link with the user. Braig thought to himself, going unnoticed by Issei as he had already temporarily closed the connection between the two. Cynthia turned on the shower and enjoyed as the water flowed through her body. And she enjoyed it just as much as she enjoyed Issei's hands, usually so rough and strong, gently passing through her body. Issei chuckled, he was also enjoying himself. He would constantly kiss the top of her head, while sometimes stopping his hands to massage Cynthia's body. He massaged her breasts and pinched her erect nipples, while his kisses trailed down the top of her head to the back of her neck. At this point, the blonde was having a hard time keeping her moans down. Both Issei and Cynthia's breath had gotten rougher. Lemon skipped. Chichi, I love you. I love you too so much. The two said to each other, before once more going for a deep kiss. The night had only started for them. You did what? Rukia's scream made Ichigo grateful that he had brought her out first before informing her that he explained his identity to his friends. The result was to be expected. They are my friends and part of the supernatural, I don't see why not trust them. The orange-haired spoke, clearly not seeing or caring why Rukia looked worried. What are they? She asks with her eyes closed. Well, I don't know about Cynthia, but Ice. You don't even know what one of them is? The senior Shinigami interrupts him in disbelief. As for that matter in particular, Ichigo could understand it as a valid concern on Rukia's part, but one that didn't mean much to him. We just didn't have time, besides, the way she talked about it, it sounded complicated, so of course they're going to want more time before going into some more abnormal things, well, abnormal by the standards of. I don't know exactly who's anymore, but yeah. Anyway, I trust them, the two just didn't tell me more because they wanted to give me time to absorb information properly. Ichigo wasn't an idiot when it came to Orihime, Totsuki disagreed with it, he noticed that several points seemed to have been left out of the conversation, but he also understood the couple's reasoning. Rukia however didn't share that thought, on the contrary, she sighed massaging her forehead. Shinigamis shouldn't mix with the other parts of the supernatural, Ichigo. The short girl said seriously, to which Ichigo just rolled his eyes. Then there's no problem because I'm just a Shinigami substitute. The orange-haired replied with his arms crossed. Rukia sighed. This whole issue of Shinigami substitute was new to both Ichigo and her, so the two's communication was still under work. And having to keep in mind all the time how she was breaking one of Soul Society's laws, and maybe even more than one at this point, didn't help. Ichigo, maybe I seem paranoid to you, but you need to understand. Dealing with hollows is not the only function of a Shinigami. We guide and guard the souls that are part of this land. She says, referring to Japan. We care for the world that is referred to by mortals as the afterlife, giving the dead a new place to live in. So tell me, what do you think would be a possible interest for someone to approach one of us? Rukia's explanation made Ichigo understand that her concerns weren't random or pure paranoia, and at the same time made him want to laugh at how unnecessary they were in this case. If you're worried about them approaching me to invade Soul Society and break the balance between life and death, or whatever, relax. They didn't even know I was a Shinigami before I introduced myself. That made Rukia raise an eyebrow, and Ichigo could see that information seemed to relax her a bit. And why didn't you say that before? She spoke reproachfully. You didn't give it a chance. And he answered simply while shrugging. Once again Rukia rolled her eyes, clearly more relaxed. Oh yeah, you didn't tell me what your other friend is. The dragon. Ichigo casually mentioned. Rukia looked at the face of her substitute, blinking her eyes a bit. Oh yeah, you should have started with that. She says, causing Ichigo to look confused. It's simple, dragons are straightforward. If this friend of yours wanted to invade Soul Society for some soul, he wouldn't go after you, he would just invade. That's simple. The substitute stops and considers. Knowing how direct Issei was, he was able to understand well what Rukia said. Yeah, I think I can see that. Suddenly a sound that resembles a cell phone notification beeps in Rukia's pocket. The two didn't even need to look to know what it was. Time to take care of another hollow. It didn't take long, and the next day, Saturday arrived. Issei and Cynthia showed up at Ichigo's house, who in turn called Orihime and Totsuki. Soon, Nezuko and Tanjiro also joined the group. And just to ensure Kai's safety, Issei left Apple in the same place as before, to stop the exorcists from attacking the older Kamado. Hey, what do you guys think about this movie? Orihime asked with stars in her eyes, pointing to a horror movie poster with excessive amounts of blood. Issei, Cynthia and Tanjiro looked curious, Totsuki wasn't surprised, Ichigo just found the poster bland, and only Nezuko looked scared by the poster. We've been waiting for this movie for so long. And excited at the same time. Her eyes had the same sparkle as Orihime's. Chichi, do you like this kind of movie? The Sekiryu asks the dark-haired one, who in response looks at him with a smile and nods her head frantically. It didn't take long for them to buy the ticket. Luckily Issei and Cynthia had received credit cards with access to the bank account where Marianne's money was. And it was way more than enough. They took a seat in the end, as Issei's height would likely get in the way of others. The order of the seats was as follows, from left to right: Tanjiro, Ichigo, Orihime, Tatsuki, Cynthia, Issei, and Nezuko. After the movie started, it didn't take long for Nezuko to get scared. Her first reaction was to hug Issei's arm. And as soon as she realized that, she tried to break away, but Issei put his hand on her head and looked at her smiling. The conversation with Cynthia the day before came back to Nezuko's head, and quickly making up her mind, she decided to keep her grip on Issei's arm. And it stayed that way for the rest of the movie. At different times Nezuko's grip was weaker, for example when she was impressed, or stronger, like in more tense scenes. Their various reactions around the movie amused Issei, who paid more attention to Nezuko than to the movie. Which didn't go unnoticed by the dark-haired one, who felt strangely happy about it. Not to mention that, even though she loved horror movies, she was still often scared by them, which was one of the reasons she enjoyed watching them. But with Issei, although she still felt the tension from the movie, they didn't make her panic. Maybe it made the movie less scary, but it was a feeling Nezuko appreciated. And after less than 2 hours, the movie was over. Ichigo had slept through most of it, and for some reason, Orihime had a frustrated expression on her face, while Tatsuki shook her head in disappointment. Tanjiro just shook his head, feeling bad for Orihime but happy for his sister. And Cynthia also carried a smile, enjoying the whole situation. Nice smell. Issei spoke, as soon as they left the cinema room. What smell? Ice? Tatsuki asks, confused, not smelling anything. He must be talking about the food area. Ichigo explains and then thinks to himself. Enhanced senses, huh? Is it inconvenient sometimes? But the food area is on the other side of the mall. Orihime points, confused. But I can also smell it from here. Tanjiro says, pointing to himself, confused by Orihime's surprise. Anyway, this isn't exactly normal, Nai-san. Nezuko spoke with a weak smile and a shrug. A gigantic roar was heard among the group, causing everyone to look at Orihime in surprise. Amheim-chan. Tatsuki said, impressed. The orange-haired one chuckled as she scratched the back of her head. She didn't look embarrassed, but rather had slight blushes on her cheeks. Here, Nezuko. The Sekiryu says, handing her a bag of sweets. As soon as they reached the food court, Issei noticed Nezuko's intense gaze toward a specific store, and upon seeing what it was he couldn't help but give a slight smile. Hanpitos? Did you remember that they are my favorites? Of course. The answer just made it clear that Issei was paying attention to her, and at the same time that he still had a vivid memory of their times together, even after all these years. Thanks. She answered simply, but her smile said all that was needed. Dear, it's your favorite too. Issei also wouldn't forget about Cynthia. He passed her a pudding that made the blonde's eyes gleam at the sight of the pastry. Thank you, Ice. She said, practically snatching the pudding from his hand and then proceeding to grab his left arm. He's the best, isn't he, Nezu-chan? For a moment Nezuko didn't know how to react, so she puffed out her heavily pink cheeks and hugged Issei's right arm. Yes. She spoke with an embarrassed smile and a face as red as a tomato. And even so, Nezuko felt happy and comfortable in that position, holding Issei's arms. Tanjiro smiled happily for his sister, and Tatsuki had a cocky smile on her face. She would definitely use this to tease Nezuko later on. Ichigo on the other hand observed something else. Orihime, what are you eating? He asks with an expression that is a mixture of curiosity and fear. He also leaned his body back slightly, wanting to keep his distance from what Orihime had in her hands. This. Pineapple ice cream, but I added some chestnuts and fries. Want to have a taste, Kurosaki-kun? Ichigo just smiled and gently declined, despite having a large bead of sweat trickling down his forehead and an expression that made it clear he wanted to stay away from that ice cream. Tatsuki in turn just looked at the ice cream and sighed, shaking her head. She had already given up trying to understand Orihime's tastes a long time ago. How they still let you in the ice cream shop? The questioning came from Tanjiro, who was stunned. Before Orihime had an answer, she didn't say it, just smiled calmly. Which somehow managed to be even more disconcerting. At least Issei, Cynthia and Nezuko were in their own world, happy. Bye Sin-chan. See you on Monday. Nezuko and Tanjiro spoke respectively. Thanks for bringing them here. I says, bowing to the couple. You don't need to do that, Kai-san, but thank you. Cynthia said, with a sympathetic smile. Yeah, it's no big deal. Issei spoke also smiling. Light blushes appear on Kai's cheeks when talking to Issei, and she couldn't understand why. Strangely, just being in the brunette's presence seemed to have that effect on her, with no plausible explanation, as far as she knew. Shaking her head and dismissing those questions, she and her son and daughter bid farewell to the brunette and blonde. Issei and Cynthia walked away from the house, waving to the family. If the Komodo had continued to look at the two, they would have noticed that, suddenly, they both disappeared in the middle of the sidewalk. However, the three had already gone back inside the house, Nezuko even walking around with a smile. On the other side, on top of the building where the exorcists were the day before were Issei, Cynthia and Ichigo, already as a Shinigami. We're not sure they're going to act today, are we? Ichigo asks, looking around intently. He hadn't fought anything other than hollows yet, but he could probably manage. No. Sorry, this is probably more complicated for you, right? Issei said, knowing that Ichigo was there without Rukia's knowledge and approval. He told his dad he'd be sleeping over at a friend's house, so at least that part was clean. It's no problem. If Rukia complains I just have to ignore her. What we're doing matters a lot more, doesn't it? Issei turned to face the Komodo house, all the while thinking about how happy Nezuko looked today. Happiness that he wanted, would, protect. Yes it is. Chapter 18. A short storm. Issei, Cynthia, and Ichigo split, each staying at a different point, circling the house to watch out for attacks that could come from any side. At the moment Issei had his legs and arms crossed while he was sitting on top of another building. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, but with his observation haki and aura, any suspicious movement on the enemy's part would be noticed. I wonder if there's something special about their lineage. Elsha mentioned, finding the movements of the exorcists to be curious. Why? Issei asks. Rogue exorcists aren't that organized, they usually act alone. For a whole group of them to move, there must be a special reason. Within Issei's mind space, Elsha explained as she had a hand on her chin with a thoughtful expression. Ever had to deal with them before, El-chan? The brunette asks curiously. Fufufu, not really, I just learned it by watching others. Issei nodded his head at her explanation. It was when at that moment that he finally realized something. Moving his right hand behind his head he catches a bullet and throws it back where it came from, killing one of the exorcists on the spot. At the same time, two exorcists jumped in to attack him, trying to slash him with their swords. They acted together and now it was too late to back down. Shigen. They didn't even see Issei moving his fingers and they were already dead. That was fa. Before the Sekiryuite could celebrate his victory, he widened his eyes and turned towards the Komodo house. Two new presences had suddenly appeared inside the house. Shitsoru. At high speed, the Sekiryuite headed toward the house. A few moments earlier. What's the problem, Nezu-chan? My food isn't as good as Ice-kun's. I spoke, teasing her daughter after seeing her just playing with her food with her fork. Mo. You know that's not it, Ka-chan. The girl responded by pouting and avoiding her mother's gaze. I could see you had a lot of fun today. I think more than in a long time. Tanjiro added with a smile, before stuffing a lot of food into his mouth. Fufufu, is that true? I smile said 1,000 things to Nezuko, even if no words were uttered by her mother. It is. The girl replied shyly before finally eating something from her plate. Ara, how interesting. Kai said as her smile grew bigger. Well, but isn't he dating Cynthia-chan? The older woman asked, placing her index finger on her chin. Tanjiro gulped down yet another bite of food and looked away, while Nezuko, as red as the boosted gear, also shyly looked away as she nodded her head in affirmation. But Cynthia said there is no problem. And she added quickly, still not able to look at her mother. Is that so? Fufufu, dear, whatever makes you happy I will support. Nezuko and Tanjiro looked at their mother in surprise. The two didn't know exactly what they expected from her reaction, and they were still taken by surprise. What? She asked, tilting her head and staring at the two. Honey, I just want you to be happy with whoever you choose. Ice-kun seems good for you, and she stops and sighs, before continuing, smiling again. I know you will soon discover how good it is to love and be loved. Kai reaches out and gently touches his daughter's cheek, which holds her mother's hand affectionately. I hope you enjoy the sentiment. Some words weren't said, but they didn't need to be either. Kai understood well what she was saying, and both Nezuko and Tanjiro knew it. And I will. Nezuko spoke determinedly and with tears threatening to escape her eyes. The three smiled to themselves, the mood in the dining room had clearly gotten better. And yet, suddenly everything seems to cool down. Without knowing why, a bad feeling fills the family. Unfortunately, you will not have that opportunity. The voice came out of nowhere in the middle of the room, bringing a chill to the family. The dining room light was suddenly dimmer and the shadows were stronger and unnatural, moving across the room. And suddenly there were two more people in the house. Who are you? I yelled, getting up and pulling Nezuko and Tanjiro behind her. The change was too abrupt for them to understand what was going on. The second leader, the one carrying a gas tank, removed his breathing mask and threw the tank to the ground. He didn't say anything and just looked at Kai. His eyes changed from human-looking to owl-like, still with a dark purple color to them. As soon as Kai looked into those eyes she froze, her body blanched and a scream of horror left her mouth. "Mom!" Both sister and brother screamed at the same time in terror. They held their mother who had lost all the strength in her body and she struggled as if trying to get away from something. "What did you do?" Tanjiro shouted in rage, fuzzy and scared. However, the only response he received was a gun pointed at his head. "Nai-san." Tears welled up in Nezuko's eyes as she tried to pull Tanjiro out of the way. If one looked into her eyes right now, one would notice that her pupils seemed to turn into slits, not looking like human eyes at all. The second leader was about to pull the trigger when Issei appeared in front of him. No words are uttered by the Leviathan, who crumpled the weapon and upon looking into the second leader's eyes, which were still owl-like, exerted his conqueror's haki and aura on him, causing him to pass out. "I see, eyes of terror." Elsha says something, but Issei was too furious to pay attention. He ignored the leader of the exorcists who looked at him in a daze and walked over to Nezuko and Tanjiro, who were confused and scared. "Get some sleep, when you wake up everything will be better," he said, gently running his hand over Nezuko's head, who felt her eyes grow heavy as she drifted off to sleep. So did Tanjiro, and Issei gently placed them in comfortable positions on the floor. Then he looked at Kai, who was still having a fit of terror and placed his hand on her forehead. At that instant, the leader of this entire group thought he could catch Issei off guard and covering his katana with shadows, he proceeded to slash the Sekiryu, who didn't even look back. The door to the house abruptly opened and Ichigo rushed in. The leader didn't have time to understand what was happening when the orange-haired made a diagonal cut with his Zanpakuto, destroying the ceiling, but also cutting off the exorcist's arm. "Trying to use darkness to hurt my partner. Fool." Surprisingly he didn't make a fuss about it, just covered the cut part with a mass of shadows. Seeing that his chances were low, he decided to try escaping, stepping into one of the shadows in the room. His body began to dip when Cynthia appeared, grabbed him by the collar, and pulled him up out of the shadows and knocking him out at the same time. "How are they?" Ichigo asked worriedly. "They'll be fine, but..." Issei replied, primarily referring to Nezuko and Tanjiro, but when it came to Kai he was uncertain. The Eyes of Terror is a sacred gear that instills fears in the victim's mind. For people active in the supernatural most of the time it's just a mild annoyance to deal with, but for mortals, it can be fatal. Elsha explained, making Issei tense more. While Kai had stopped screaming she was still dangerously pale and squirming. Indistinguishable murmurs came out of her mouth that probably reflected the nightmare she was trapped in. "Let's take her to my family's clinic." Seeing the older woman's condition, Ichigo quickly offered, however, Cynthia shook her head. "We won't get there in time." Cynthia's words were just what the Shinigami feared. Issei sighed as the boosted gear appeared in his hand. Rather than shock, the substitute Shinigami just looked at the gauntlet in confusion. "Adjust. 200. The announcement was made and Issei placed his thumb in the center of Kai's forehead, closing his eyes. Not long ago he used this technique on one of the exorcists and destroyed his mind. But now he needed to wake her up and honestly, he couldn't imagine other options other than dealing with her nightmares directly. The problem before was brute force. Take it easy. Taking a deep breath, he makes his attempt to enter the matriarch's mind and pull her out of her whatever visions were haunting her. If his previous attempts to use that technique could be boiled down to a flood washing over everything in its path, his current attempt was far more comparable to the gentle flow of a river. He didn't fight to enter, he just started the path and let himself be led. Beside him, Ichigo and Cynthia were anxious. The orange one wasn't sure what Issei was doing, but considering Cynthia's expression he understood that it was a risk. Unfortunately, all they could do was hope for the best. Interacting with the mind and mental spaces was always a somewhat confusing experience. For the Sekiryu time started to pass slower and he could no longer distinguish between minutes and hours. But suddenly, he was still in the house, just with no one around and with everything dark, like a blackout had occurred. Izuku Tanjiro. The scream, clearly from the Komodo matriarch, sends Issei running outside the house. I was on her knees screaming in tears, looking at something that made Issei shiver and widen his eyes feeling an ache in his heart. The mangled bodies of Nezuko and Tanjiro were hanging in the air, their eyes open, empty, and lifeless. Their corpses were suspended by steel wires, with different parts of their bodies on display separately. Their expressions were of genuine terror. As if that wasn't enough, that view repeated itself all over the horizon, wherever they looked, with Kai's son and daughter mutilated in different ways, hanging in the air. It stunned Issei to the core and was destroying Kai's mind. "You tried to forget me." A male voice, in a thick tone, but speaking as low as a whisper, resounded throughout the place. No, honey, I didn't." Did you think you could go on without me? From the shadows emerges a man who Issei could only assume to be Kai's late husband, Tanjiro, and Nezuko's father. However, the conditions he found himself in were just as bad as the two now. Parts of his body, such as one of his arms and even the side of his head, were missing. In addition, he had several cuts, from the largest and deepest capable of showing his insides to the smallest and most superficial. All his body was covered in injuries, he was a walking corpse. You tried to forget me. Move on, thinking you could have a life and be happy again. After what happened to me. After seeing what was done to me. He slowly approached Kai, who was crying in panic, barely able to form a sentence. But there's still time if you want to have our family together again. He says, stretching his arm towards Kai, who instinctively does the same. Perhaps, at that moment, she thought that if she held that hand, she would have some relief. Until Issei appears in front of her. Issei-kun. Upon seeing the Sekiryuite, a bit of clarity appears in her eyes. Ai-san, look at me. He says, taking her hand. Everything will be fine. Nezuko and Tanjiro are fine, nothing will happen to them or you, ever again. No matter what happens, you will be fine. I will guarantee this with my own life. Unbeknownst to Issei, his eyes had taken on their draconic form, with slit-like pupils and deep bluer eyes. In the background, darkness, and the bodies began to disappear in blue and crimson red flames. However, rather than terrifying, those flames were cozy, giving a feeling of warmth and security. As she looked into Issei's eyes, Kai felt that every word he said was true. In her mind, giving way to fear, there was now a sense of security and confidence in the brunette. Why you promise? The insecurities were gone, she didn't even hear her late husband's voice haunting her mind anymore. Issei puts his hands all around hers and gives her a look of assurance that made her feel safer than she ever did. With my life. It was simple and direct, at the same time honest and confident. The shadows that surrounded them disappeared, giving way to a red and blue light, along with a warm, comfortable feeling. At that moment, after years of being traumatized by her husband's sudden death, of questions about whether she was doing the best for her children, and all kinds of doubts and fears, now she felt none of that and could close her eyes in peace. To finally rest after this terrible experience. Opening his eyes, Issei saw that the woman was now breathing steadily and slowly regaining her color. He lifts her, carrying her in his arms, and Cynthia does the same with Nezuko, while Ichigo carries Tanjiro on her back. With a wave of his hand, the two leaders of the exorcists are caught in a rope of air controlled and float beside him. Now the trio had bigger concerns, but at the first opportunity, they would interrogate the two. Let's go home. At least they could go on knowing they saved their friends. Chapter 19. And what comes after? It was the smell of food that made Nezuko wake up. She opened her eyes and lifted her upper body while looking around, feeling better and more rested than usual. She didn't recognize her surroundings, which should have been a bad sign, but she strangely felt a sense of security about that place. On her right side was her brother and on the left was her mother, both of who woke up soon after. Mom Nai-san. She grabbed them in a hug, taking both by surprise since they were still waking up. Nezu-chan. What? And then all the memories of before they went to sleep came back, or at least in Kai's case, before she was put under the influence of the eyes of terror. They remembered the two men who suddenly appeared in the middle of their house, threatened them, and pointed guns at them. Yo, you guys woke up. It was Issei's voice that brought them out of their thoughts. The three looked at him in amazement, seeing that Cynthia and Ichigo, with strange clothes and a ridiculously large sword on his back, were beside the brunette. What is happening? Tanjiro asked, completely confused. The Sekiryuite, the blonde, and the substitute Shinigami faced each other. It is complicated. Ichigo said, scratching the back of his head. The three knew there was a lot of explaining to do. The stunned looks of the Kamado family made the trio of Issei, Cynthia, and Ichigo remember the old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. The family still hadn't said anything, but it could already be seen that they had hundreds, if not more, of questions. That's quite a lot. I was stunned at how much information had suddenly been revealed to her family, and most importantly, the type of things she learned about. Yeah, I reacted like that too. Ichigo spoke sympathetically. He was the one who best understood what the three of them were going through at that moment. We are not human. Nezuko's look and expression were just one of confusion. It wasn't like the information had changed the way she felt or anything like that. After all, through all effects and causes, she both felt and knew that she was still the same. Our father descended from an Oni. And Tanjiro was in a similar situation to his sister. Dazed and confused, but overall okay. As okay as someone that had his life threatened hours ago could be, though all happened so fast that he didn't even associate it. From what we could gather, yes. Cynthia stated with a nod. And that's why they. I didn't finish speaking, but grabbed Nezuko and Tanjiro in a hug. She didn't need to say anything. As quick as they had been, the memories of what had happened earlier still troubled her. What happened to those two? Tanjiro asked after taking a deep breath. They won't hurt you anymore. Issei's response was automatic. Nezuko and Kai felt reassured by his words, while Tanjiro nodded his head. They're still alive, aren't they? Issei, Cynthia and Ichigo faced each other and looked at Tanjiro. We still need answers. The orange-haired clarified. So you still haven't questioned them, huh? Indeed. Cynthia confirmed after Tanjiro asked. Hearing his questions, Nezuko and Kai were visibly cornered, but Tanjiro sighs and gets up. I'll go with you. From the way he spoke, it very clearly wasn't a question. Once again the supernatural trio faced each other in a silent and quick discussion. Honestly, the three of them were out of their comfort zone. Are you sure? Issei asked, wanting to see a resolute confirmation from Tanjiro. The son of the Komodo family once again took a deep breath and nodded. I need to understand. It was all he said and all he needed to say. Especially because they could understand the feeling of suddenly having something completely new and surreal thrown at you and wanting to understand it. With Issei, it had been his Leviathan powers, and with Ichigo, his position as a Shinigami substitute. Nai-san. Tanjiro. Nezuko and Kai, however, didn't see it that way. Don't worry, they are no longer a danger. We guarantee it. Cynthia's words made them feel better, but it was inevitable that the fear would be there. I'll stay here while they go ask the questions. Issei spoke, sitting down on the floor. Even if it was consciously or not that Kai and Nezuko's shoulders relaxed, it became clear that the Sekiryuite should stay for the two to feel safe. It's not dangerous, right? I asked once more, hugging her daughter. No danger. The confidence in Ichigo's voice would have to be enough. Who are you? Both Ichigo and Tanjiro were surprised at how emotionless Cynthia's voice was. I don't know how used to interrogating others she is, but she seems to know what to do. The knife the blonde held against one of the exorcists helped a little with the process. The exorcists were tied, and not by a normal rope, but by some material that Ichigo tried to cut and couldn't. And if they tried to use their powers, it was apparently for nothing, since they were both still trapped here. Exorcists? The shadow user replied, trying to pretend calm, but the sweat running down his forehead said the opposite. Renegades. Ichigo added, wanting to see if he would get a reaction. And indeed he did. What do you freaks know? The only thing that bothered Ichigo in that entire speech was the fact that the man spoke screaming, annoying his ears. You tried to kill my family. But it was only natural that Tanjiro wouldn't take it so calmly. As it should have been done a long time ago. As soon as he said that, he was presented with the tip of the knife in front of his eye. A single move from Cynthia and he'd be one-eyed, or worse. They are innocent people, practically civilians. Why? Perhaps Ichigo's question alone wasn't that intimidating, but his heavy sword pointed at the exorcist did the job. They are descendants of Honest, but there's something else, isn't there? Cynthia spoke, pulling the knife back a little, giving him room to speak. So you got that much together at least. But why should I say anything? In the next instant, he saw his own death. His head was cut off by the knife, without any ceremony, a quick and painless death. A chill ran down the exorcist's spine, and his body was covered in cold sweat. His eyes were wide and his pupils dilated. It had only been a vision, the result of Cynthia manifesting her killing intent. Do you want to start talking now? And her voice sounded more frightening in the exorcist's ears now. Why yes. Dragons are so cool. At the moment Issei was demonstrating his powers over water, manipulating it in many different ways, making the liquid take various forms like sculptures. Nezuko looked excited, any distraction, even more so from Issei, was welcome. So, your father is a dragon. Or your mother. Curiosity also came from Kai, who was still slowly getting used to how surreal her current situation was. Issei stopped to think a little before saying anything. After all, the answer was too complicated, and the last thing they needed now was to have to explain about the Straw Hats and pirates who could travel between different worlds. My father has dragon powers. Which wasn't a lie since Luffy had taken Kaido's fruit years ago. But it's more complicated than that. One day I'll explain better. Here's Cynthia, and it would probably be her since he wasn't so confident in his ability to explain their situation coherently. I understand. It was hard to imagine since Kai had no point of reference for what the supernatural world was like. Imagining a world where all the supernatural creatures she'd heard about in myth and legend, and probably thousands, if not more, of others she'd never heard of, were real was a scary thought. And it was not easy to think that, most likely, now this would be her world, the type of world Nezuko and Tanjiro had been thrown out of nowhere. Worry and trepidation filled Kai. If the two had already been put under attack before they learned of their parentage, what would happen now? Are you okay? But before she can get lost in those thoughts, Issei's worried and curious voice reaches her. Just a little scared because, well, I don't know what's going to happen now. She had a weak nervous smile as she said that. It was strange to open up in that way to someone her son's age, but Issei made her feel comfortable to do so. But I know what's going to happen. Kai and Nezuko looked at him, not exactly surprised by his attitude as they already started to expect this kind of thing from Issei, but curious as to what he would say. And what will happen? Even Kai was surprised by the hopeful note in her voice. Whatever you want. Mother and daughter waited for him to elaborate, but noticing that he wasn't going to, they tilt their heads showing curiosity. Just then Issei realizes they don't understand and goes further. Not to brag, but I'm pretty strong. So whatever you want to do, keep living like before or join the supernatural, I'll do my best to make sure you will be just fine. As Issei spoke, he patted Nezuko's head and looked at Kai with a peaceful smile. Mother and daughter stared at each other and then Nezuko hugged him tightly and Kai took the dragon's hand. Thanks. When Cynthia, Ichigo, and Tanjiro returned, they noticed that Nezuko and Kai felt calmer and safer. What did you find, Nai-san? None of the three knew how to begin the explanation, and they were surprised that it was Nezuko who took the lead in the matter. Ichigo and Cynthia looked at Tanjiro, who nodded his head. He had to be the one to explain this. We are not only descendants of Honus, at least not of any Honus. The older Kamado started to explain, scratching the back of his head. Apparently, our lineage is stronger, better with magic, and so on. Hearing this, the Leviathan and the mother-daughter pair furrowed their eyebrows. That's vague. Issei started and Nezuko finished. The others nod in agreement, not exactly a lot of information despite having some value. It's what we have. Tanjiro speaks with a sigh. They attacked us just because of that. Hearing his sister's question, Tanjiro didn't say anything else, just sighed. Nezuko bit her lower lip anxiously. The idea that her family was put in danger just because she was part of a bloodline of supernatural creatures, which she had just found out about, who were perhaps a little stronger than normal, was hard to wrap her head around. She was just calm because of Issei, and yet, it was all surreal to understand in such a short amount of time. I will contact Susanoo, he will know what to do with them. Cynthia declared, leaving to contact the god of storms. I need to check something, I should be away for a few hours, but I'll be right back. Ichigo, on the other hand, had his responsibilities as a Shinigami substitute and judging from how his cell phone was ringing, Rukia probably had a lot of things to talk about. Also, since they didn't want to burden the Kamados with a lot of different information at once, the explanations of what exactly Ichigo was dealing with would come later. They gave the general picture for the three of them, that he dealt with spirits and monsters, but left out certain details, like the term Shinigami. Tanjiro? Issei called out to his friend, both to find out what he was going to do and to see if he was okay. I'm fine, but I need to sleep. It's been a long day. He didn't show it before because of adrenaline, but now Tanjiro was visually exhausted. He would probably fall on the bed in the guest room and pass out for hours straight. Issei was considering what he should do at the moment when he felt a tug on his shirt. Ice-kun, you don't mind if we stay here with you, right? Nezuko asked, this time not looking away from his face, but looking directly into the Leviathan's eyes, even though she was red with embarrassment. She was also holding her mother's hand, who surprisingly had the same question. Smiling, Issei affectionately pats Nezuko's head. Stay as much as you want. With Issei's confirmation and even encouragement, Nezuko felt bold and ignoring her burning face, sat on his lap, who only widened his smile and continued to stroke the Oni descendant's dark hair. I sat next to them, with his little finger resting against Issei's. Neither of them said anything about it, sometimes certain things just don't need to be said. Chapter 20. The Oni King. You just arrived and all of this has already happened. Even though Cynthia couldn't see Susanoo's face, she could very much imagine the expression he must be making at the moment. Yes. As always, problems tend to follow us. She responds with a slight smile. Ha. Get the exorcists ready, I'll send someone to get them. Normally that's Amaterasu's job, but I don't mind lending a hand to you too. The god of storms takes a break and Cynthia can't hear someone talking to him. She notices that the voice is familiar, but can't hear it well enough to distinguish who it belongs to. Ah, Hachiman wants to come and meet you too, so he will go himself. Uncle Hachi. That's good, we haven't seen him for a long time. Issei will be happy to hear this. Hearing the news about the coming of the god of war made Cynthia smile, and it would definitely make Issei happy. Although his appearance would probably surprise the others. Well, maybe it's better to get them used to it little by little. Luckily Uncle Hachi is friendly enough. The next morning Issei and Kai worked together to prepare breakfast. Pancakes, eggs, bacon, coffee, bread, toast, and various other things filled the table and spread the smell throughout the living room and kitchen. Even though they were made quickly, everything is delicious. Ice-kun, you really are a professional chef. After once again tasting Issei's food, Kai couldn't help but praise him. Ichichi, it's no big deal, I'm sure you could learn all this quickly and would do better than me. Issei responded with a wave of his hand and a goofy smile on his face, happy to have someone outside of his family complimenting his cooking skills. It was a nice feeling to know that Kai appreciated and liked what he did. Really? Maybe if you taught me I really could. She responds casually, clearly not having thought much about what she said. Sure, it would be great. And Issei responded in such an equally simple and casual way that Kai almost didn't register what he said. Sorry, could you repeat that? Kai asks, wanting to confirm what she thought she heard. It would be fun. I don't know how much I can teach you, but I bet you will learn everything very quickly. The Hyoudou carried a smile as he said those words, showing that he seemed excited about the prospect of teaching her what he knew. That made a smile form on Kai's face. Then I'll be counting on you, Ice-kun. Ichichi, I'll do my best. After that, it didn't take long, and soon Cynthia, Nezuko, Tanjiro, and Ichigo joined the table. The first three were rested after a good night's sleep, while the orange-haired one was exhausted and didn't even seem to have slept at all. Did you have a difficult night? Tanjiro asked, seeing how Ichigo looks ready to fall asleep at any moment. I've had better nights. Ichigo replies with a shrug. Which part of supernatural exactly do you deal with, Ichigo? Nezuko asked curiously as she ate a slice of bread. I am a substitute Shinigami. He says while pouring some juice for himself, without thinking much about what was just said. As a result, the three Kamada look at the orange-haired as if he had grown a second head. So, you guide old people who have just died to the afterlife. Didn't you say something about monsters too? And what do you mean by substitute? A substitute god. How do you substitute death? A spoon of cereal was about to go into Ichigo's mouth when he stopped halfway. More or less. But not exactly. I think it's best to start from the beginning. But that, while they ate, Ichigo explained about the hollows, how he found and met Rukia and received her powers, in a way forcing him to take the position while she recovered. He also explained the obligations of a Shinigami, at least as much as Rukia had told him. As soon as Ichigo finished, they finished breakfast, not having a crumb of food left on the table. It seems complicated. Tanjiro says, making Ichigo nod. Yeah, but I'm getting used to it. It would only be better if the hollows stopped appearing in the middle of the night. He says, rubbing his eyes. At that moment Issei and Cynthia felt a familiar presence, indicating that Hachiman had arrived. I'll be right back. We will ensure that they are handed over to Amaterasu-sama's faction. The god of war says, pulling a scroll from his sleeve and placing it on the floor. The scroll opens on its own, revealing what looks like a seal or magic circle inscribed within it. With an explosion of smoke, the two exorcists disappear and the scroll closes before being picked up by Hachiman, who once again places it in his sleeve. Issei had to whistle at the display of magic. Cool, but I still prefer my gear's storage. A smile formed on Hachiman's face with the Hyoudou's comment. Indeed, the storage power of your gear is quite convenient. The god of war said, before turning his face towards another direction of the house. Issei knew he was looking at where Nezuko and Tanjiro were and asked. Do you know something about them? Hachiman remains a little thoughtful before responding. Perhaps. It's thin, but I feel the lineage of the Oni king in both. Have you explained to them what you are doing here? Issei nods a yes. I talked about you and asked if they wanted to meet you. They seemed interested, but talking to a god is still a bit much for now, according to them. That makes Hachiman laugh slightly. I understand, it's a shame, but comprehensible. Would you like to know about the Oni king? As much as he asked a question just in case, Hachiman already knew what Issei's answer would be. After all, the young man wouldn't want to leave his friends in the dark and also wouldn't like to be in the dark. For sure. The young dragon said, just as the war god imagined he would. Very well. It's quite simple actually. He was an Oni with more power than all the others, both physically and magically. Honestly, I don't even know what his origins were, if he gained his powers after meeting another kami or some other type of event that could change his destiny, or if he was simply born different from the other Oni since the beginning. Hachiman said, moving his hand, causing paintings to form and float through the air, illustrating the story to Issei. His strength attracted several creatures and mainly other Onis, but they were all defeated and devoured by him. This, of course, does not necessarily mean that he was invincible. For example, his strength was lower than that of us Camus. I believe that he would be at what is currently considered the conqueror level. The devils call it Mau. I believe those admirals you told us about would be the equivalent, although I don't know how they would compare. Hachiman spoke as he showed the figure of an Oni at the top, surrounded by several others. Anyway, among the Onis, his strength was unmatched, no other came close. Between his species, he was unique, capable of mastering any magic originating from our faction with ease, only being unable to use powers exclusive to specific races, such as that of the Kitsunes. His physical strength was also tremendous, and to add to that he had great regenerative powers. In short, he was the strongest Oni that ever existed. For a moment Issei sees the silhouette of a man with horns and a body with clearly non-human features, being surrounded by several Oni kneeling to him. Hachiman then swings his arm and undoes the images. Is he still alive? Issei asked curiously, since the way Hachiman put it the Oni king had either disappeared or died. However, the Sekiryuute found it difficult that someone strong like that would die. We do not know. He just disappeared, which is quite common actually. I highly doubt he's dead, he just must have lost interest in current affairs and decided to keep it to himself until something that instigates him appears again. Having said all that, neither Susanoo nor I knew he had any descendants. Perhaps Amaterasu-sama knew about it, but I'm more inclined to imagine that not. Tsukiyomi-sama however definitely knew about it. Issei just nodded his head, knowing that the god of war spoke the last part more to himself than to the actual Sekiryuute. I understand, I'll talk to them about it then. Perfect. Ah, yes, there is one more thing I have to discuss with you Ice-kun. He stops and forces a cough before continuing. You still have the amulet that Susanoo gave you to hide your draconic energy, correct? Issei nodded his head. It's in the gear, why? Hachiman sighs and presses his thumb and index finger to the bridge of his nose. It turns out that it just masks the draconian nature of his energy and not actually the total energy. Therefore, what remains is another aspect of your aura's nature. In essence, your somewhat perverted nature affects your aura. Before Issei could ask anything, Drake manifested through the boosted gear suddenly appearing on Issei's arm. What exactly do you mean by that, god of war? Hachiman coughed and decided to explain at once. Apparently, without the draconic nature in Issei's aura, what remains is an aura of lust. There is a long second of silence followed by the god's words. Issei was still somewhat confused, but Drake was just speechless. Fufufu, I have to say, this really suits Ice-kun. It is Elsha who breaks the silence, even though Hachiman cannot hear her. I don't understand, what does he mean by an aura of lust El-chan? As he hadn't felt any difference, the Leviathan had difficulty grasping what the war god meant. After all, what even was an aura of lust? Is this some joke? It must be right. And Drake was in disbelief, almost in denial. The strongest Red Dragon Emperor was perverted enough that it affected his aura. If someone had told him this a millennium ago, Drake would have laughed and killed the person. Now it was reality. It's quite simple Ice-kun. Think of an incubus or in the case of a woman, a succubus. I believe that by hiding your dragon nature, your aura is equivalent to theirs. Although I have my suspicions that you are worse than an incubus. Elsha explained, making Issei understand. The brunette was curious, wondering if this aura had any use or how he would even go about using it. Seeing Issei's expression go from confusion to understanding, Hachiman imagined the mental conversation that must have occurred. Oh yes. Before the god leaves, the Leviathan asks one last thing. Any tips for tomorrow? Hachiman thought for a moment before he simply said. Just be yourself. After the conversation with Hachiman, the day passed peacefully. Issei explained what the god had told him about Nezuko and Tanjiro, but besides being intrigued by the story, they didn't even think much more about it, after all, even though they were descendants of the Oni king. It wasn't like this information had much relevance for the two who were still getting used to the idea of the supernatural. Now, on Monday, the group of Issei, Cynthia, Nezuko, Ichigo, and Tanjiro were in front of the old Kuo school building, from where the Sekiryuute and the blonde could feel the presence of the devils. Have you met them before, Ichigo? Tanjiro asked. Although being fully informed about his situation, they, like Issei and Cynthia, were just unsure of the extent of his interaction with the devils. Rukia did most of the talking, I just sat in the corner and listened. It was over before I even realized it, and I didn't say anything before she pulled me out of the room. Ichigo explained with a shrug. Issei heard nothing of the conversation. He felt something strange being in front of that building, and even more so feeling some of the presences that were in it. At the same time as he knew he had never been here or met these people, there was an intimacy and familiarity. Clearly, some of it came from the connection he had created with Hyoudou when he found him, but there seemed to be something more. It was as if Issei was exactly where he should be. Let's go. Without even understanding why, the Sekiryuute had great expectations for this meeting. Chapter 21. The Devils of Kuo Academy. Kuo Academy is recognized for its refinement and high-level education. When people think about it, they think about the top students and the best possible study conditions. That said, the academy could be a bit liberal when it comes to its students, but that is beside the point. In reality, what mattered at the moment was one of the buildings of the academy, which was completely opposite to the image most people had of it, and yet it made as much part of the students' imagination and how they saw their academy as every other part of it. That was the only abandoned building in the area. The old building was known by everyone, student and teacher alike, as being where the Occult Research Club operated, with the club's president being Ria's Gremory, one of the three princesses of Kuo. Currently, in the club room, not only were all members present, but also were the two other women who shared Ria's age and position. One was naturally Sona Citri, or Sona Shitori as she was known to the normal humans that frequented the academy, and the other was Hinata Balam. Hinata had beautiful, long, straight dark hair reaching to her waist. She had abundant breasts with well-defined hips and skin that was a little pale, to the point that everyone who looked at her would immediately think of the fragility and beauty of a porcelain doll. Just as Rias was president of the occult club and Sona was president of the student council, Hinata was president of the tea club. But you really know nothing about this man. Not that I blame you for this, of course. Hinata asks her peers, adding the last part a little nervously. It was notable that she was outside of her comfort zone. Yufufu, don't worry Hinata, we understand. But even though we don't know anything about him, I have a good feeling. Rias replied, trying to calm down her friend, knowing that she was normally too shy to deal with this kind of situation. And, indeed, even though she only exchanged glances with Issei, she had a great feeling when thinking about him. Lost in her thoughts, the Redeed didn't notice Sona frowning because of what she said about Issei. Hey, I understand why you three are here, but why are we? Behind the sofa where the three sat were the rest of Ria's club members. The one who had spoken was Naruto Gremory, Ria's cousin, and a blonde of medium height. Interestingly enough, one of the things that made him stand out was the presence of cat whiskers on his cheeks. He was by far the most relaxed one in the room, not because of a lack of respect, but because it was simply his way of being. Which was a bit frustrating for Sona at the moment. We have to give a good impression to our guest Naruto-kun. Imijima Akeno, essentially Ria's second-in-command, responds. She was a young woman with dark hair tied in a ponytail and a well-developed body. Her breasts were disproportionately large and her hips were just as well-developed. Akeno was the definition of the term hergless figure. But if Ni-san has a good feeling about him, he must be a nice guy. The blonde replied, shaking his head up and down. We hope so. That came from the second blonde in the room, Kibayumi. She had long blonde hair and blue eyes, with a mole below her left eye. Her figure was also well developed, although not as much as Ria's, Akeno, or Hinata. While Akeno had an almost sensual beauty, Yumi had a certain refined beauty, like that of a female knight, in addition to an athletic appearance. Next to her was a young girl a head shorter than Yumi. That was her adoptive sister Kibatosuka, who also belonged to Ria's peerage. Just like her sister, she had long hair, but instead of blonde, it was white. She also had a more petite and modest appearance than the rest of the group, while also carrying the same air of class as her sister. Asuka was on Yumi's right side, while on the blonde's left side was Mash, their last adopted sibling. Like her older sister, Mash also had an athletic appearance and well-developed body, having breasts that were even slightly larger than her older sister's. She had short lilac hair and gave off a similar air to Hinata, appearing to be the calmest of the three sisters, who were already not very agitated to begin with. Next to Mash was Taoju Kaneko, the last member of Ria's peerage present. Kaneko, like Tosca, had a petite appearance but was even shorter. Furthermore, she also had white hair and was the only one in the peerage who wore a shortcut. Kaneko was also the only one to maintain a neutral, practically indifferent expression throughout the whole conversation, while everyone else in the peerage had either a friendly or curious expression. When will they? Asuka was going to ask about the newcomers when she stopped in the middle of her sentence, feeling a few presences approaching the abandoned building. Well, it's a bigger group than expected. Akeno comments, placing her hand on her chin. It looks like there were some last-minute changes. Besides, one of them is Kurosaki-san, right? Sona says, crossing her arms thoughtfully. Yes. It's curious to see him approaching without the Rukia-san nearby. Rias responds, even more curious than Sona at this development. They didn't have much knowledge of the internal state of the Shinto faction, so the two figured it made sense for the Shinigami who were operating in the area to join the conversation. However, Ichigo was a replacement, so in theory, it would make more sense for Rukia to come. And this was all disregarding the fact that Rukia had made it clear that she didn't intend to get involved with them beyond what was necessary. Rias shook her head, putting those thoughts aside, as the group had just arrived at her door. Please come in. Irideed speaks with a melodious voice, and Issei does exactly that, opening the door and entering accompanied by Cynthia, Nezuko, Ichigo, and Tanjiro. As soon as they entered, Issei felt a feeling of nostalgia hit him. His eyes quickly swept over Akeno, Yumi, and Kaneko, before looking directly at Rias. He couldn't explain it, but there was a warm feeling of affection and love in his chest. He felt an impulse towards them, and it was only his steely will that allowed him to not take any strange actions. At the same time, he felt a familiar energy stirring within him. Issei thought, calling out for the dark dragon, but got no response. Yet he could now feel presence within him with more clarity. And it wasn't just Issei who felt something. Rias felt nostalgic and safe, as if just Issei's presence made things better. She had no idea why she was like this, but she couldn't deny that it was a good feeling. Bakeno felt like her heart skipped a beat. A cozy warmth spread across his chest after seeing Issei, for reasons that she could not even start understanding. And yet she really liked that feeling. Umi felt something similar to both of them, a warmth, security, and confidence that Issei's presence seemed to bring to her, without her even understanding why. Hanako also felt all of this. It was almost as if she had gone back to the time when she was still with her sister, before she turned into a monster that abandoned her. However, for some reason, what she felt now seemed almost better compared to back then. She also had no idea why, but putting rationality aside, she instinctively wanted to get closer to Issei. Hello. I believe we didn't have a chance to introduce ourselves properly before. Perhaps already know about us, but I'm Sona Citri, and these are my colleagues, Rias Gremory and Hinata Balam. Seeing that Rias didn't seem very responsive, for whatever reason, and knowing that Hinata certainly wouldn't take the opportunity, Sona took the initiative, introducing herself and her friends. Yo, I'm Issei, this is my girlfriend and my friends. Issei in contrast presents himself in a much more simplistic and direct way, pointing to Cynthia, who smiles and waves at those in the room, and to the other three with them. I'm Charlotte Vinsmik Cynthia. The blonde says, nodding slightly at the three devils on the sofa. And I believe you are already aware of our friends. The three nod their heads back, and it is Rias who continues the conversation. Yes, it's a surprise. May I ask why you are here? She questions, looking at the unexpected trio of Ichigo, Nezuko, and Tanjiro. Just to follow up. At least me. The orange-haired responds with his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but only because he was quite nervous about the possibility of Rukia appearing out of nowhere. She had made it very clear that she wanted to distance herself from the devils at the academy. Nezuko and Tanjiro had a problem, and we ended up discovering that they have supernatural descent. And since they are with us, we thought it would be better to bring them. Issei explained, looking at Rias, who stared at him for a few moments lost in thought. I see. She ends up saying after a few seconds of silence, blinking several times to regain her focus. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but are you the supervisors of this region? What do we need to talk about exactly? Cynthia asks, making Ria's posture change completely, becoming more serious and professional. Sona didn't show it, but internally she was pleased with her friend. Let's start from the beginning. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.